On behalf of the Toronto South Local Immigration Partnership, the National LIP Secretariat, and the Neighborhood Group, we are honored to support the creation of this resource. Our intention is to continue supporting initiatives that inspire connections, learning, and action, particularly those that deepen Indigenous newcomer relationships. We are grateful to be a part of this partnership and excited by the possibilities it opens up for future community-led collaborations and shared learning. Next, I have the honor of introducing Alix Reynolds. Alix is Red River Métis, French Métis, and settler Scottish, currently living in Treaty 2 territory in Manitoba. Alix's personal, academic, and professional interests have centered equally on refugee issues and Indigenous cultural regeneration, both in the Canadian and global context, with a keen interest on the natural allyship and common ground between the two. Since 2021, Alix has been supporting the Truth and Reconciliation work of the Canadian Refugee Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association and its member organizations. She is also a co-founder and advisory committee member of the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation, the NNCTR. Alix's interests center on reconciliation and healing with Indigenous communities, namely her own Métis community, applied decolonization, putting reconciliation into action, building relationships of understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and working specifically to encourage Indigenous refugee solidarity. Thank you. Alix, it's all yours.
Kanche tout le monde, bonjour indinoe maganag, agamaya I mishike minese. Mangigijeba wan indego, mangin totem, nimiskozi be wasako dekwe, karrieri var makaiver indishwane cause. Nindane kubajiganag bionjiba miskozi be basadina, bin deja wani Manitoba. So hello everyone, and greetings all my relations who are tuning in from all across Turtle Island. Gachimi Gwitch, a big thank you to all of you for taking the time to watch this session. I'm enormously grateful to the Toronto South Local Immigration Partnership, the National LIP Secretariat, and the Neighborhood Group, and to Ruben for his kind introduction and inviting me to speak to you on the topic of building solidarity with Indigenous people through the lens of land back. So during this talk, I'm going to speak to you about why it's important for newcomers to Canada and those in the newcomer settlement sector to participate actively in truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people, and why it's vital for newcomers and those working in the settlement sector to work in solidarity with Indigenous people. And I'm also going to speak about what acting in solidarity means. Most importantly, I'm going to talk about how actions of solidarity with Indigenous people need to be rooted in the concept of land back. And we're going to spend some time unpacking that concept of land back so you understand what it means to Indigenous folks and why rooting your actions of solidarity in land back is essential if we are to show up in this work in a good way. So finally, I hope to leave you with some practical tips and strategies for doing this important work and how you can take steps to build relationships with Indigenous people in your own local communities. So I also included with this presentation a resource and discussion guide. So you'll find all the resources that I refer to throughout this talk in the guide, so you can take a deeper dive. And the guide also includes a number of questions that you can use within your organizations and networks to encourage further deeper discussion on these topics and to help determine what the best course of action looks like for you. But first, I want to start by telling you a bit more about myself, where I come from, and about the particular Indigenous perspective that I'm speaking from. So back at the start there, I introduced myself in a traditional way in Anishinaabe, or the Ojibwe language, which is one of several ancestral languages of the Red River Métis people. This is how I would introduce myself in important gatherings, including traditional ceremonies where Anishinaabe is spoken. So, what I said there is that the name by which the spirits know me, and that was given to me in ceremony, is Loon in the Morning Mist, and I'm from the Loon clan. The name my parents gave me is Alix Reynolds. I'm Red River Métis. My Métis ancestral names are Cadiad, Rivard, and McIver. I'm also Franco-Manitoban, from French ancestors who were French by blood, but Métis in their hearts, minds, and family connections, and their Métis kin embrace them as such. This was all back before the settlers started to flood here into the Northwest. So those Franco-Manitoban family names are La Gimaudière, No, and Landry. I'm also settler Scottish, bearing the names of Reynolds and Rutherford. I come from the Red River Valley in the traditional lands of my Métis ancestors, in the very southernmost part of Manitoba, the area governed today by Treaty 1. So I want to give you more of a visual idea of where exactly I'm located on Turtle Island. So let's bring up a map. So here is a map of what we today call Canada. And you'll find me right here, right in the middle, right in the heart of the continent, the heart of Turtle Island. I like to say right in the in-between. So I'm going to zoom in on this area here around the city of Winnipeg to give you a closer look at the Red River Valley. So the Red River Valley is this area south of Ga'okosing, or what is known today as Winnipeg. And it's where Muskogee Bay, the Red River, runs north up from Pembina, North Dakota, here just across the US border. And it runs north up through Winnipeg, and then making its way up north to Winnipegamic, Zagaegan, or Lake Winnipeg. So this area around present-day Winnipeg represents the very heart of the Red River Métis Nation. This is the area where my specific ancestors come from. My grandmother's family moved from the area. Originally, they lived directly in and around what is known today as Winnipeg. But following the Red River Resistance, they eventually moved down further south. And my grandmother is here from this community here called Saint Malo. And I lived in this area for most of my life, but today I'm coming to you from about 2 hours northwest of the Red River Valley, up on the northwest shores of Lake Manitoba, or Animozi Bing. So let's zoom in on that area here. So you'll find me in around here. And this is a place where Métis culture is very much alive and well, where you still see today the interconnection of Métis and Anishinaabe, with many families having members or cousins who are both. We're positioned here between Sandy Bay, Ojibwe First Nation, just down to the south of us, and Ebb and Flow, Ojibwe First Nation, here to the north. And of course, we have Lake Manitoba bordering us on the east, and Riding Mountain National Park, the famous park that's in the shape of a gun, and easy to identify on a map, is over here to the west of us. And all in between here, there's lots of wildlands and ranches. So we're really close to a lot of wild spaces here, very close to nature. And the whole area kind of in between here, especially in between these two First Nations, is really Métis country. So it was always really customary to have Métis communities bordering First Nations communities. Because you see, the Red River Métis, we were almost completely dispossessed of our land. We don't have reserves. And many Métis folks, were too visibly Indigenous to assimilate into white European communities and not considered treaty band members to live on reserve. So Métis people back in the day, we tended to live on the fringes. That's why there was a time that we were referred to as the road allowance people, living in the scraps and the bits of land in between. We've always very much been an in-between people. So this whole area here is ancestral Anishinaabe territory. And we're here at the very western edge of Anishinaabe or Ojibwe territory that runs from all the way out east by the Ottawa River Valley, through the Great Lakes region and southern Ontario, out here to the western edge of Manitoba, and even into the plains of Saskatchewan. And Ojibwe territory also goes down south into the US, into Michigan, Minnesota, and a bit beyond. This area is also Cree or Innu territory. And in general, the Cree territory also runs east to west across Canada, but in the north. So you have the Cree territory running across the north, and you have Anishinaabe territory running east to west along the southern part of Canada. So this is Cree territory and where it overlaps with Anishinaabe territory. So it's also the ancestral land of the Oji Cree or the Anishinaabe, as well as the northernmost extent of the Oceti Sakowin or the Dakota and Lakota people, who primarily live down in the United States, just south of us, but their territory extended all the way up here. And of course, we're also here in the historic Northwest homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. So this area is governed by Treaty 2, which was actually just signed up the road here from where I live, maybe about a 10-minute drive up the road, in a small Métis settlement that's today called Kinnesota, but it used to be called Manitoba House. Now, the First Nation and Métis traditional way of life is very much alive and well and celebrated around here. There's lots of folks who work as ranchers, but also many, many who work as fishers on the lake. They fish in the summertime and also do commercial ice fishing in the winter. So there's lots of great pickerel, especially, or walleye to be had up here. If you've ever had the chance to taste that, you'll know how wonderful that fish is. There's lots of hunting that goes along around up here. There's lots of natural areas to forage for plants and medicines. What I think is really neat is there's this whole kind of informal network of trails all throughout the area. We have basically, a highway that runs along the west side of the lake here, and another highway that goes kind of north to or east to west. But otherwise, the whole area is just full of these the trails that people use to get around on ATVs or on snowmobiles in the wintertime. And there's no map of these trails; they're just known to the people who travel them. You'll see in this area languages like Anishinaabe and Michif are widely spoken. There's powwows and round dances and other cultural celebrations that take place. In the summer, there's a big event called Stomperfest, and that's a big Métis jigging competition. And the woods all around here are really alive with music. There's tons of incredible musicians, Métis fiddlers, guitar players, singers. Our people really love to make music and dance. In this area, you'll see the distinctions between Métis and Anishinaabe people are not really as defined because many families are made up of both. And so, as I mentioned, we have Ebb and Flow First Nation and Sandy Bay, and they're both Ojibwe First Nations. They're about 100 kilometers apart here, but they have very different histories, which is kind of interesting. The people from Ebb and Flow were actually originated out east, and this community was established as the Anishinaabe migrated west, kind of pushed out of the east in search of food and resources. So that's where they have their roots. But Sandy Bay here is really interesting because they're an example of a Métis community that received treaty instead of script. So treaties were primarily negotiated between First Nations and the Crown as a sort of collective agreement to recognize Aboriginal title and rights. And our First Nations relatives fought very hard to have their Métis family included in treaty. But for the most part, Métis people took what was called scrip. And the script process was directed at individual Métis people, where our ancestors could choose either a cash voucher or land far away from their home community in exchange for their land at Red River. So the script process was incredibly corrupt, and it was primarily designed to extinguish Métis title and to dispossess us entirely of our lands, which it was very successful at doing. But as I mentioned, Sandy Bay is an example of a Métis community that was actually included in Treaty 1. The folks who established Sandy Bay were actually Métis Ojibwe, and they were affiliated with a group of Ojibwe folks from down here near Portage la Prairie. And they were accepted into treaty so long as they moved up here to the west side of the lake. And you see, this was not very good land here. Lake Manitoba is a very shallow lake. It's very marshy. It's great if you like watching birds. It's a big old bird sanctuary, but it's not very good for farming or anything really. So many of the folks who took that treaty actually tried to get out of it and to get Métis script instead, because they weren't really pleased with their prospects on being put on such poor land. But that's a little bit of history. And what's also really interesting to note about Sandy Bay is that of all the Anishinaabe communities in like Anishinaabe territory, from all the way out east to all the way here down into the States, Sandy Bay has the highest number of fluent speakers of Anishinaabe. And it's something crazy. Like, I don't quote me on this statistic, but I remember it being very, very high, upwards of 75, 85% of the community are speakers of Anishinaabe. So there's been just a ton of work, and it's a real hotbed here for the resurgence of the Anishinaabe language. And if you go to the store here, you're just as likely to hear Anishinaabe spoken as you are to hear English. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of where I come from and the community that I live in. So now there are a few more things that I need to say about myself, so you understand my specific positioning as an Indigenous person and the specific Indigenous perspective that I'm speaking from. So I've mentioned that I'm Red River Métis, and I want to take a moment here to explain a bit more about who the Red River Métis people are, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about who we are, even amongst our own Métis people. But the history and the identity of the Red River Métis is one that is very specific. So, Section 35 of the 1982 Canadian Constitution recognizes and affirms the existence of three distinct Aboriginal peoples in Canada, whose rights are protected by the Constitution. And these three groups are First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And these three groups are accorded rights under the Canadian Constitution. So let's start talking, though, about who the Métis are not. So the Métis are not modern-day people of mixed Indigenous and European ancestry. Say, for example, if a treaty status Cree mother had children with a Swedish father, their children wouldn't be Métis because they're mixed. They would inherit the treaty status of their Cree mother. Similarly, Métis people are not just individuals with one distant Indigenous ancestor. Like, for example, having a Mohawk ancestor a few generations back. This does not make you a Métis person. It makes you a person with a Mohawk ancestor. So the Métis emerged during the fur trade era, when in the mid to late 1700s, European men working in the fur trade had unions with Indigenous women, and their resulting mixed heritage offspring, born in and around the late 1700s and early 1800s, were the first generation of the Métis. Now, generally in Red River, these unions were between Scottish men and Cree women, and French men and Anishinaabe or Ojibwe women. Although, of course, there were many exceptions. Now, I want to note that these unions happened everywhere that the fur trade happened in Canada. That is to say, pretty much everywhere. But the evolution of these mixed heritage people, their context and history differed regionally across Canada. So, in most parts of Canada outside of Red River, many of these mixed heritage offspring eventually assimilated into the mainstream community, even while holding on to their Indigenous cultural traditions and their community connections. But in Red River, something special happened that makes the Red River Métis distinct, and that is that an ethnogenesis occurred. An ethnogenesis is when a new culture emerges that's distinct from the cultures that created it. That is to say that Red River Métis people emerged as a new nation, a new culture with our own unique traditions, lifestyle, and distinct language informed by the European and Indigenous cultures that gave birth to us. So, due to our mixed ancestry, we are an incredibly diverse nation. Some of us, even while living our own unique Métis culture, aligned more closely with the European lifestyle of our fathers, while others aligned more closely with the Indigenous lifestyle of our mothers. And it's important to know that before we were colonized, we were all much more united, not only amongst ourselves as a diverse Red River Métis nation, but also with our European and First Nations family members. So within our highly diverse nation, we call ourselves by different names. Métis people, French Métis, that's the specific Métis community that I come from, the Michif, the Bois Brûlés or the half-burnt woods people, the flower beadwork people, or as the Cree call us, the Opitamisawak, the people who own themselves. So while the Métis were historically multilingual speaking a wide variety of Indigenous languages, including Cree, Anishinaabe, Dene, and of course the European languages like English and French and even Gaelic, we also have our own unique language called Michif. And there are several different dialects of Michif. There's French Michif, which is largely French borrowing from mainly from Cree. There's Northern Michif, which is Cree borrowing from French. There's Southern Michif, which is primarily spoken in southwestern Manitoba, southeast Saskatchewan, and northern North Dakota and Montana. And there's Bungay, which is actually a dialect of Scottish English that draws on Cree, Anishinaabe, and Gaelic. So I'm going to show you here, we'll take a little bit of a closer look at the Métis, the historic Northwest homeland of the Red River Métis. So you can see on here, everywhere where there's these like slotted lines, this is all the Red River Métis homeland. And it extends from over here out in Ontario, all through Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, to the Rocky Mountains and up towards the Northwest Territories. On this map here, all the red lines that you see are actually all the historic fur trade routes. So you'll see that, of course, our territory extends and kind of overlaps all those same fur trade routes. Um, and of course, we were as Métis people, we were semi-nomadic. So we traveled around a lot. We followed the bison herds because that was our primary source of food. And so we roamed all over this homeland, which is why there's Métis settlements all throughout this area. And the Red River Métis communities that are all found throughout this area, of course, overlap with several First Nations territories. And you'll see here, you'll see the Cree territory running along the north here. You see the Ojibwe territory running along the south. And here's the Oceti-Sakowin, the Dakota, Lakota coming up from the south down in the US here up to the prairies. And this area also includes a lot of communities that were established by the Red River Métis diaspora as we were dispossessed of our lands at Red River and dispersed all throughout this region following the implementation of the scrip system. So today, in order to acquire Métis citizenship, there's a few things that need to be in place for an individual. An individual needs to self-identify as a Métis person. They need to be distinct from any other Indigenous group. They're not also First Nation or Inuit. They need to be accepted as a member of a present-day Métis community. And the key part is that we have to have ancestral ties to the historic Métis community, which means tracing our genealogy back to individuals from Red River who received scrip. If you ever meet Métis people, you'll see that we love looking at our genealogy. We have to have our genealogies done in order to apply for citizenship and become Métis citizens. And that genealogy needs to trace back to ancestors who received scrip and who were identified as Métis people. Because I, for example, have ancestors, remember those Franco-Manitoban ancestors that I mentioned who were embraced as part of the Métis community? Some of them received scrip, but they were Franco-Manitoban, and it says right on their scrip document that they're French and not Métis. But and so an individual cannot claim Métis citizenship today solely on scrip records that came from French Canadian individuals. But it really goes to show how intertwined that community was. And this is all predating the settlement of the Northwest, which really began with the arrival of the Selkirk settlers, which is well after the Métis people were already established. And I'll show you on the next slide what a scrip record looks like. So this is actually one of my own scrip records from my own genealogy. But just to give you an idea of what this document looks like, so you have your genealogy done. There's one organization in Canada, the St. Boniface Historical Society, that does all the genealogies for Métis people who are applying for their citizenship. This is an example. This is my ancestor André Carrière's scrip record. And so you'll see that, he was established in the community of St. Norbert, which is really just a community right at the southern edge of Winnipeg. Anyways, that gives you a little bit of an idea of who the Métis people are. So I'm Red River Métis, but I'm also settler Scottish. So you'll find that sometimes I say we as in we Indigenous people, and sometimes I'll say we as in we settlers, because I'm both. And that can be a pretty complicated space to be in. I'm sure many newcomers to Canada who are Indigenous to the lands they've left behind and now finding themselves as settlers here in a new land might be able to relate to this complicated space. I do think that given that positioning, having a foot in both worlds, that Métis people are especially well positioned to lead the work of truth and reconciliation. You see, the Métis have been facilitating the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people since we sprung up from the land. So I really come by this work honestly. My commitment and passion for working towards truth and reconciliation is rooted in my ancestors, the Métis more broadly, but also my specific ancestors, some of whom were leaders in the Red River resistance movements and helped facilitate the creation of Manitoba as a province. So I've always felt that being Métis and having this foot in both worlds was a really privileged position, allowing me to sort of slip into the spaces between these worlds and to pick up the drop threads of all the broken relationships here on Turtle Island, whether that's even amongst the Métis people, our relationships between Métis people and First Nations people, and the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here on this land. And to pick up those threads and to weave them, weave those threads of those broken relationships back together. This always makes me think of the traditional multicolored sashes that the Métis are known to weave, called the ceinture fléchée. And they're like the ones my mother makes. And I really like that symbolism of weaving the relationships back together. But I really want to make clear that I'm no expert. There are very few experts on this new path towards reconciliation that we are forging. We are each bringing our own unique lived experiences as Indigenous people to the conversation. But of course, I'm only one Indigenous voice, and in no way could I ever speak on behalf of all Indigenous people. No one is capable of doing that because the Indigenous community here on Turtle Island is just too diverse. So I really encourage you strongly to seek out the Indigenous voices in your local communities and listen to what they have to say. And I want to remind you again that I'm also a settler voice. So I'm speaking from both sides of the story. Now, I say I speak primarily from the perspective of the Métis and more specifically the Red River Métis, but also as a white person, a non-racialized, non-visibly Indigenous person. This has given me a very different lived experience because I get to choose every day whether I identify as an Indigenous person or not. And so I've not had the experiences of racism that many of my Indigenous community members and family members have experienced. Um, but I am somebody who has spent the last 30 years of my life also having to reconnect with my heritage and my culture and my own indigeneity. That's because, like so many Indigenous people, I was not born and raised connected to my culture. I became disconnected because my mother was adopted out of the Métis community. Others became disconnected because of the residential school system or the 60s scoop, both of which stole children and shattered families, or due to the shame and violence that caused people to hide their heritage to protect themselves. I was really lucky though. I reconnected with my Métis family in the late 90s. My mother got to have a relationship with her mother for 15 years before my grandmother passed. But not all Indigenous people find their way home so easily, and some not at all. So, luckily today, many of us are returning and reclaiming our Indigenous identities because of the connections to historical figures that I have in my family line, and my genealogy was readily available. I could get the right colonial paperwork, like that script record that I showed you. That's not so easy for everybody. A lot of people have a real hard challenge tracing back their family roots and getting that colonial paperwork to be able to regain their citizenship as Métis people. At this point in my life, I've spent more of my life now connected than disconnected from my community and my own indigeneity. And it's really only having crossed that point that I could even give myself permission to speak publicly as a Métis person, feeling now that I've more fully returned home. So now I took the time to tell you all of this because for me, it's really important to be specific about the perspective and position that I'm talking from. And you know, I want to invite you to take a deeper dive to learn more about the Métis. This book here, I've included it in a link to it in the resource guide, but it's called The Northwest is Our Mother by Jeanne Taillet. And I would say that this is one of the most excellent and comprehensive stories of the Métis people. All right, well, let's get into things. To start off, there's something that I want you all to keep in mind when you're doing this work of truth and reconciliation. And that is that this work requires a brave space because the medicine that we're working with is the medicine of discomfort. Often we talk about creating safe spaces because we all carry our own traumas and life events that have shaped us, and we know we want to treat people, even those we might disagree with kindness and respect and be gentle with one another. But in these spaces, where we are talking about truth and reconciliation, we need to be more than that. We need a brave space because the medicine that we're working with is the medicine of discomfort. There's no comfortable way to disrupt and dismantle colonialism. We can't change the ways that we've been conditioned to believe and operate without some discomfort. And it's all going to be a bit unsettling. So I say it's the medicine of discomfort because it plays such an important role. Discomfort is incredibly transformative. When we feel discomfort in these conversations, and you all know that feeling, it might feel like shame or ignorance or disbelief. It might bring up defensiveness or resistance, but it's not something to resist. I've been taught that discomfort is not a feeling to run away from, but rather a feeling to run towards. And it's really not something to be afraid of. It's simply pointing us in the direction of something that we need to stop and consider more deeply, that we need to have a conversation about. A brave space is also important because in this work, there's no such thing as a safe space for Indigenous people. By involving ourselves in this work, we are inherently putting ourselves at risk. A lot of what we have to say as Indigenous people may make you feel that discomfort I'm talking about. And sometimes feeling that discomfort can make folks really defensive. We are often having to point out to people, sometimes people who hold power over us, ways that they could think or behave differently. And that can also put us at risk. Another side of it is that by speaking out in this work, we also put ourselves at great risk of lateral violence from within our own communities. The grassroots activists and even elders and knowledge keepers that I know who write and speak publicly, they receive attacks from others in our communities all the time. So that's really something to keep in mind. We also need to be brave as we do this work because we're not always going to do everything right. We're all going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And that's how we learn. And that's why we need to be brave. So, why does it matter? Why does truth and reconciliation matter for newcomers to Canada and the newcomer settlement service sector? Why is it important for us to be having these conversations? Why is it important for newcomers and those in the settlement sector to build relationships with Indigenous people rooted in solidarity? Well, first, Truth and Reconciliation is an important national project underway in Canada. And finding a role to play towards advancing truth and reconciliation is the obligation of all non-Indigenous people and organizations in this country. Truth and reconciliation is not just something happening between Indigenous people and the state, or the Crown, or between Indigenous people and the church. Truth and reconciliation is not a project that will be successfully implemented from the top down. Actual lived and enacted reconciliation can only take place from the grassroots on up. It's about the relationships between individual people at the local level, getting to know one another and understanding each other. So, reconciliation is also not the responsibility of Indigenous people. As Justice Murray Sinclair stated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, the responsibility of Indigenous people is to reconcile with ourselves and our own indigeneity, with our own communities, and with the land. Our focus is to return to the traditions, the teachings, the ceremonies, the languages, and to reconnect that umbilical cord that once connected us to the land. But as far as Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Project has been going, the reality is that Indigenous folks are doing most of the heavy lifting. There has not been one thing accorded to Indigenous people that has not been hard fought for by our people. So it's time for non-Indigenous people to turn their words into actions. And until we see that, I can tell you that there's a general sentiment amongst Indigenous people, particularly amongst our youth, that reconciliation in this country is dead. There's a lot of criticism because we're not seeing much in the way of action to truly end the oppression of Indigenous people in this country that remains active and ongoing and not just a part of the history books. So Canada does not do much to involve Indigenous people in setting its immigration policy. What that means is that Indigenous people do not have much say in terms of the nature of immigration to this country. It also means that there are no effective measures in place to ensure that newcomers to Turtle Island are introduced to Indigenous people in a good way, that they're educated on the historical and present day oppression of Indigenous people, or that they're invited into this national project of truth and reconciliation. So one example of, the lack of consultation with Indigenous folks in terms of setting immigration policy is to consider the annual immigration levels. And the consultation process that's used to inform those levels. Now, I was under the assumption that Indigenous folks were likely not really consulted as part of that process. But I wanted to check my assumptions. So I looked up the most recent a report on the immigration levels consultation process. And the most recent report that I could find was from 2023. And what I found was this. There are a variety of mechanisms that are used to inform the immigration levels. And one of those is an individual survey that's sort of broadly filled out by individuals in Canada. But when you look at the results of that survey, the results aren't parsed out to tell you, which respondents are Indigenous or what percentage of the respondents are Indigenous. What informs the levels more is an organization survey. And that survey is sent out to a broad range of organizations in the country, ranging from community-based organizations to businesses. And in 2023, that survey was sent out to 6,772 organizations. Now, how many of those organizations in total were Indigenous? I don't know, but I'd be very curious to see that full list. But what I can tell you is that 997 organizations responded to that survey. And of those, only 1.1%, a grand total of 11 organizations, self-identified as Indigenous. And 7 of those on the list were specifically Indigenous community organizations or Indigenous governments. In 2022, there were 0 Indigenous respondents to the organizational survey. Now, another method of informing the levels is a series of roundtables and town halls that are held in Canadian communities across the country. But none of these roundtables or town halls are specifically held in Indigenous communities. Now, IRPA mandates that the government must consult on levels with provincial and territorial governments. And so there's a working group called the Forum of Ministers Responsible for Immigration. And this is one of the main sources of input on the levels. Now, the thing is that there's no one at that table representing Indigenous government. And that makes me wonder if the Canadian government is committed to a nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous people and Indigenous nations, why don't Indigenous governments have a seat at this table? Basically, Indigenous people are really excluded from the immigration process. And I assure you that we would have a lot to say about it if we were included. You know, many of our communities have been impacted by the imposition of state borders that have cut through our traditional territories, that have separated our communities. Many of us, as nomadic and semi-nomadic people like the Red River Métis, we valued freedom of movement. Many of our traditions embrace the values of being good hosts and welcoming strangers. Look how we received and supported the first European newcomers to our shores. That didn't turn out so well for us, but it demonstrated our values of welcoming and extending care to those from outside our communities, and especially those who are suffering or in need. Here in Red River, the Métis community was well established by the time the first settlers arrived. The European fathers of the Métis Nation were, of course, already here, but they were voyageurs and fur trade men, not settlers. While they were no doubt, a part of the vanguard that helped pave the way for the strong arm of colonialism to eventually push its way into our lands, their survival and success of these voyageurs was entirely dependent on their assimilation into First Nations communities already here. So they adopted the life ways of the First Nations, not the other way around. They learned the languages and the traditions of the people, and many also embraced a traditional way of life. They were entirely dependent on the First Nations mothers of the Métis Nation for their survival in Red River. And of course, their offspring were embraced as First Nations relatives. So when the Selkirk settlers arrived in Red River in 1812, the arrival of those newcomers did not bother the Métis. We believed in freedom of movement. So the trouble arose when Lord Selkirk tried to impose rules on the settlers and extend these rules to the Métis. We didn't like that so much. We are the Opitimisawak, the people who own ourselves. So that brought the conflict, and we resisted it fiercely. But given our values, I really wonder how Canadian immigration policy might change if Indigenous folks had more say in it. For example, would our input increase the focus and priority put on the humanitarian aspects of immigration policy? Might we open our doors to more refugees and asylum seekers if Indigenous people had more say in the process? Remember that community of Sandy Bay that I mentioned? Well, there was a point in time where the Sandy Bay folks adopted a Nigerian nun who had been working in their community, but she was at threat of deportation. So the community adopted her, and they adopted her in order to try and provide her with legal status. Now, that fight went to the Supreme Court, where the court decided that the people of Sandy Bay did not have the right to determine who belonged to their community. But I think it's a very interesting question, because why don't Indigenous nations, as sovereign nations, have that right? So instead, Indigenous people are almost completely excluded from input into Canada's immigration policy. Immigration remains a force being enacted upon us. with no mechanisms in place to foster good relationships between Indigenous folks and newcomers. I can tell you that there is an alarming anti-immigrant sentiment growing amongst Indigenous people. How could there not be? And I'm constantly hearing stories from our community members of incidents and run-ins. And there's a lot of bad sentiments being fostered. And we, as an immigrant settlement sector, really need to look at how we can connect with Indigenous communities to address this. Because the reality is, and I'm not going to mince my words here, but immigration has always been a tool of colonialism. It's one of the tools that the colonial state here in Canada used to dispossess Indigenous people of their lands and the resources from those lands. Those resources, extracted from stolen Indigenous lands, are what makes Canada a wealthy nation capable of receiving immigrants. So if you have immigrated to Canada, or if your job exists because of immigration to Canada, then you are actively benefiting from the ongoing dispossession and continued oppression of Indigenous people. That might be very uncomfortable to hear, but it's the truth. So the question becomes, how can we subvert this? How can we work to decolonize immigration, to disarm it, and turn it upon itself so it can no longer act as a tool of colonialism, but as a tool of community building? As newcomers to Turtle Island, as people working with newcomers, what are your obligations? I would suggest that your obligation is to build good relationships with Indigenous people in your local communities and to take actions of solidarity in support of those people. We don't need to wait for the Canadian government to include Indigenous people in immigration policy making. We can start right now in our local communities. And as I said before, reconciliation will never be achieved from the top down, but from the grassroots on up. And that is where you have your power. But to do this, we need to take a clear and critical look at ourselves. We have to ask ourselves the hard questions. Most importantly, we need to look at how we can go beyond words into action, because action is what's needed to change this. Now, I want to introduce you to another piece of essential reading that you'll also find a link to in the resource guide. And that's this article called The Politics of Allyship with Indigenous Peoples in the Canadian Refugee Serving Sector. It's by my colleagues at the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation, Chizuru Nobegalani and Mbalu Lumor. And they are writing for the refugee serving sector, but the article speaks way more broadly to all the immigrant serving sector. And I firmly believe that everyone should read this article and read it several times. Come together and discuss it at your organizations, in your networks. It's a real foundational piece for our sector, and it does a great job of really highlighting the inherent tensions that exist as settlers resettling more settlers on stolen Indigenous lands. It really encourages our sector towards self-reflection and self-examination to understand the ways we may be complicit in Indigenous oppression, to understand how power relations operate within our context, and how we become complicit when we conform to dominant colonial discourses and narratives. The article also identifies some key areas of tension and questions that we should be asking ourselves, along with asking us how we can change all this by acting to decolonize our sector. So some of the tensions and questions that it highlights are what obligations do we have towards Indigenous peoples as settlers resettling settlers on stolen land? Can we even conflate all migrants into the category of settlers, since some not migrants come to Canada due to the impacts of colonization elsewhere? Are people of color settlers too? Not all migrants are economic migrants who come to Canada. Some refugees are Indigenous to the lands that they left behind, and this heritage may even be the reason of their migration to Canada. How can they maintain their indigeneity in a new land? So, also what's really important and what the article addresses is how we can decenter some of these colonial narratives, such as Canadianizing, citizenship romanticism, how we celebrate Canada Day, humanitarianism, and how we talk about the humanitarian nature of Canada. These all have implications for relationships with Indigenous people. So we really need to give more thought to the narratives that we're telling, the stories that we're telling in the immigrant serving sector, and the impact that that has on reinforcing colonial mechanisms and ideas. We need to look at ways that we can decenter these, how we can decenter the whiteness and the colonial ideals and center Indigenous ways instead. For example, how can we learn from Indigenous people and center their knowledge in our settlement practices? I think of the Canadian Center for Victims of Torture, who've really been doing, I mean, they've been a main driving force behind creating the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation. And they're really doing some cutting edge work in this area. And one of the things they're doing is using Indigenous-led land-based learning as part of the services that they offer to victims of torture. It could be as simple as these initiatives that are popping up in the development of EAL curriculum that teaches about Indigenous folks while newcomers learn English. How can we incorporate some of these into our actual practices to go beyond just the community building and social gatherings, but actually work these things into our practices, our services, and disrupt the process that way. I always like to turn to this idea of settler versus guest, and this is also something that an idea that is shared in that article. And this idea of settler versus guest, it comes from Haudenosaunee academic Ruth Colizar-Green. And Ruth states, as a settler is an individual who states that they're on stolen land. They might know whose traditional territory they're on, and they might wish to be a good ally, but usually a settler's intentions stop there. But a guest, on the other hand, understands through a reflexive process that as a guest, they have responsibilities. The guest learns the history and current story of the land that they're guests on, and then they politicize that understanding. And it's that politicizing that understanding that is the real key part here, because that is what is at the heart of solidarity. So let's take a look at allyship versus solidarity, because there's a really important distinction here to be made. In the past, I've often used these terms interchangeably. Until a couple years ago, I was at a Canadian Council for Refugees conference in Calgary, and there was just a fantastic session at that conference. And it was led by a number of immigrant academics who, all of whom had been taking a real deep dive into Indigenous issues and Indigenous culture, and they were all speaking on that topic. And one of them really talked about this distinction between allyship and solidarity. And after that, I went up to him and I said, I always use these terms interchangeably, but I'm not going to anymore. Now I'm going to talk about solidarity instead of allyship. But really, what is the difference? Because it's important to consider that difference in this work. So let's see. Let's take a look at allyship. Allyship is often performative. It's heavy on talk, but light on action. Allyship usually prizes civility. Allyship often focuses on interpersonal relationships, those real feel-good gatherings, community feasts, that kind of thing, which are great, but they don't really help us to really get to the heart of the matter. Allyship generally does not result in the redistribution of resources, and that is the heart of the matter. Allyship, ultimately, it risks very little. Allies simply have no skin in the game. But solidarity, on the other hand, solidarity is talk and action. Solidarity works and focuses on systemic change. Solidarity is disruptive. Solidarity focuses on redistributing the ill-gotten gains of systemic oppression. Solidarity does not shy away from hard truths, conflict, and messy disagreements. Solidarity works to dismantle systems, structures, and institutions in ways to remove the systemic injustices that cause the oppression. So recognizing what solidarity actually means, what it looks like, is very important for centering any actions that you take. So we can make sure that the actions we are considering are rooted in Indigenous solidarity. Now, if we want to make sure that our actions towards truth and reconciliation are being done in a good way, then the first thing we want to keep in mind is that our actions are rooted in solidarity with Indigenous people. But the next most important thing to keep in mind is that our actions also be rooted in the concept of land back. Now, many of you have likely heard the Indigenous call for land back, but you may not know exactly what it means. So here are a few things that I've heard in my conversations with immigrants and newcomers when they hear the word land back come up. Sometimes I hear, so do they actually want all their land back? Or as a newcomer, I hear Indigenous people say land back and it makes me nervous. Or land back. It's so scary for immigrant communities and refugee communities. And this always comes up in our trainings. What do they mean by that? So you remember the medicine of discomfort that we talked about? Here it is. And as I said, when we feel that discomfort, the kind of discomfort that these folks are expressing in these quotes here, it just means that we have to have a conversation. So let's have a conversation about land back. Let's unpack the land back concept so we can see how it can be used as a lens to better inform and guide our actions and ensure our actions are rooted in Indigenous solidarity. Now, before we unpack the concept of land back, I do want to talk about the land and the idea that many may think is absurd of actually giving the land back. I want to talk about why that idea is not so absurd and why it matters. So, the main project of colonialism was and continues to be land acquisition for the purpose of resource extraction. So, I want you to take a look at the map on this slide. It's from nativeland.ca, which is a fantastic website to really dive into and better understand the Indigenous territories that you're living on. So, one of the things I want you to notice is how the Indigenous territories here, how they all overlap. It's not like in today's world of nation states where there's these hard and fast boundaries and borders around our territories. There was a lot more shared space on Turtle Island. But the main thing I want you to notice about this map is note that the land is 100% populated by Indigenous people. So I'm going to show you a different map. This map is a map of all the First Nations reserves in Canada, the land that's been left in the hands of Indigenous people. And this is just First Nations people. This does not include the Métis people. This is just a map of First Nations reserves. And each point on this map is a reserve. And see that now, in the modern era, after colonialism has powered through Turtle Island, that 99.8% of the land base is in the hands of settler Canada, and only 0.2% is in the hands of Indigenous people. To show you another visual to better drive home the point, 99.8% of the land base in Canada in the hands of settler Canada, 0.2% in the hands of First Nations. Now, I think that Christy Belcourt says it best here. Christy Belcourt, for those of you who are not familiar, is a very prominent Métis artist and grassroots activist. Definitely an Indigenous voice that you should follow. And I think she says it best right here. Canadians need to connect the dots between residential schools and resource extraction, between child welfare and resource extraction, between missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people and resource extraction. It's always been about the land. Now, this is one of the main points that's made in the book, The Reconciliation Manifesto, by Indigenous leader and grassroots activist Arthur Manuel. This book is an absolute must-read. And of course, I've included it in the resource guide along with another book by Arthur Manuel called Unsettling Canada. This book, The Reconciliation Manifesto, is a fantastic place to start if you want to learn more specifically about the Indigenous perspective on reconciliation and what Indigenous people need from the reconciliation process. Now, Arthur Manuel passed away a few years ago. He was from British Columbia. He was an enormously influential leader and activist working for Indigenous rights, not only here in Canada, but also as an extremely vocal advocate for the global Indigenous rights movement. And before he passed away, he left the manuscript for the Reconciliation Manifesto, which essentially provides a roadmap. He really gifted us with a roadmap to reconciliation, which is why I would say this is one of the most important books that you could read. But I want to read you an excerpt from the book. I have it here, because it really drives home this point about colonialism always being and the oppression of Indigenous people in Canada always being about the land. So what he writes is this: looking at it in another way, while Indigenous peoples are around 5% of the population, we have been left with just 0.2% of the 100% lands that were originally given to us by our Creator. This is, in simple acreage, the biggest land theft in the history of mankind. This massive land dispossession and resultant dependency is not only a humiliation and an instant impoverishment, it has devastated our social, political, economic, cultural, and spiritual life. We continue to pay for it every day in grinding poverty, broken social relations, and too often in life-ending despair. But that was always part of the plan. We were left isolated and hungry while our land generated fabulous revenues from the lumber, minerals, oil, and gas, and agricultural produce. We were to be kept penned in on our 0.2% reserves until we were starved out and drifted into the skid row in the city and gradually disappeared as peoples. Our dependency is not some accident of history. It is at the heart of the colonial system. Our poverty is not an accident, the result of our incompetence or bad luck. It is intentional and systematic. There is only one program to solve this dependency and despair, and that is to get rid of the deadening weight of the colonialism that causes it. For us to once again have access to our land, and for the settlers to recognize at last our creator-given title to it. So if you want to identify the very heart of the problem, this is it. Our communities simply cannot be strong and healthy without resources, without economic justice, and without access to our lands. So that's very, very important to keep in mind. But land back as a concept is ultimately about way more than that. Let's start unpacking it by listening to what some Indigenous youth have to say about it. Now, I'm going to show you a couple clips from a video that are from the Yellowhead Institute's online land back course. Now, if you're not familiar with the Yellowhead Institute, again, I've included links to their website in the resource guide, and they are another just fantastic resource. The Yellowhead Institute is a consortium of Indigenous researchers, academics, scholars, and they produce just some really groundbreaking and just very important research coming from the Indigenous perspective. Their red papers, they have two, one called Land Back, one called Cash Back, and they do just an incredible job of presenting these papers online in a multimedia format. So I really encourage you to check those out. They also produce an annual report on the implementation of the 94 calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So they track those to monitor how many have been implemented. And they also host a whole series of, live events in person in Toronto. If you're located in Toronto, definitely go check it out. But last fall, they launched their online land back course, and it's phenomenal. Really an excellent resource for taking a deeper dive into the concept of land back and what it means to Indigenous people. So I'm going to show you this video that where you'll be able to hear from Indigenous youth about what they have to say about what land back means for them.
The contemporary origins of the land back movement, as I understand it, land back is, first of all, like a new spin on what is actually a very old idea and practice. So like if you study the Red Power from the 60s, the Ganasatake resistance, or the Ipperwash resistance of the 90s, I don't know more in the 2010s, land back to me is like the 2020 version of this. And basically it's this demand not for symbolic gestures, but material restitution. So I think for young Indigenous people, we grew up in very much this, era of reconciliation, we might call it. We grew up with land acknowledgements and orange shirts and apologies. And so for older generations who, even getting that form of recognition, we can debate whether or not it's genuine or not, but was significant in terms of a shift in Canada's approach, I guess, to Indigenous affairs. But since we grew up with it, I think that it was like ripe time that we were starting to notice all the cracks and the tolerance for that approach to Indigenous affairs. And at the same time that that was happening, these cultural creators came in with something that just seemed to so perfectly encapsulate that disappointment and the frustration and all of those things in something that was like universal and snappy. I also think what I really like about it, compared to maybe some resistance movements, again, of the 60s and 70s, is that, there's like no land back commission. Like, they don't tell you what does or does not count. And for that reason, it can be this like slogan that applies to all the different types of work that young people are already doing. So it's broad enough of an umbrella that I think all types of young people, whether you're on the res or in the city or in a remote community of any kind, you can find place for yourself within it. And that is what makes it so approachable, I think.
Land back just means so much to me. It means us not putting up with it anymore, not taking it anymore. I've heard the same thing from my grandparents that I heard from my father that I have also experienced in my lifetime, and that is racism, systematic injustice, and genocide. Nothing has changed.
It's a deep reflection on previous injustice. And going forward, if we want to really build that connection with Indigenous peoples, we have to have the land back. Land back is a philosophy.
Understanding from a deep place of what it means to be homo, to be Indigenous to the land, to be of the land. It's not just physical, it's a conceptual space in what our future can hold on the land, where we can be our entire selves and address the violence against our bodies and our minds and our hearts and our spirits. It's time and space to heal.
When it comes down to it, it's pretty simple. It is about the jurisdiction and authority and autonomy that we should have as Indigenous peoples over our own land and our own territory.
So to enact back to land or land back, I really do believe that it needs to be an awakening of a self to act, whether that's to step forward or step back as a leader. Everyone has a place in this life to stand up for what is right. Everyone has a role to play, and it's not going to look the same for every person. It's not going to look the same for all backgrounds of peoples and nations, but it's our responsibility to act.
I think it means thinking about reciprocity, about what has already been taken forcibly from Indigenous people and then what other people can be offering in return. It's not enough to acknowledge the territory, but actually thinking about what are the protocols. Do they even know what they are? How to be in conversation about asking for consent to even be present on a territory. I think settler folks need to do a lot of reflecting around what it would actually mean to live in accordance with Indigenous law.
There's a lot of movements everywhere that you can financially contribute to, because it does take resources to be out, like tiny house warriors, like Get 'em Den, like porcupine warriors in Toronto, Six Nations. People can make donations of food, time, even just saying kind things to land defenders, water protectors goes a long way as far as the morale goes.
Another thing that anyone can do for land back, enacting land back and embodying land back philosophy, is truly showing up to support front lines, truly putting resources and strength that you have out there. If you feel like you want land back but you don't enact anything, well, that's just a liberal fantasy. It's the belief that you can change the world by simply feeling a certain way. In order to actually progress the world, you have to put who you are out there and put your strength and know injustice and speak out about injustice, because land back is a reflection of previous injustice. So in order to enact land back, one must be a part of Indigenous-led movements.
the key takeaways from that video is that land back is a philosophy. It's not just about the physical land and getting it back, although that is an aspect of it, as I explained already. And it might certainly be the aspect that settlers focus on, or anyone rooted in a colonial way of thinking that objectifies the land and assigns ownership to it in a transactional sort of way. But land back is a complex concept that means much more than that. You know, there are real, almost sometimes irreconcilable differences in how Indigenous and non-Indigenous people think. And these ways of thinking can be often worlds apart. We often misunderstand each other because we are coming at things from completely different worldviews, beliefs, and value systems. And, you know, this was at the heart of the problem with the treaty making process that ended up being so destructive for Indigenous people. The colonial government and Indigenous folks were at the same table, but they were approaching the process of treaty making from two worldviews that could not have been more different from each other. And the future that Indigenous folks were imagining was not at all aligned with what the colonial government had in mind. I often like to think of land back as a bundle. In our traditions, you know, we have these medicine bundles and sacred bundles that are collections of sacred objects that are often put together in ceremony to represent a certain spiritual idea or spiritual initiative. And there's also bundles in our language. In the Anishinaabe language, you have these words that it's one word for one thing, but if you break down the parts of the word, there's all these different concepts built into it, even from certain sounds that are present in the word that imbue even deeper teachings and spiritual meaning. So the words themselves are carried and act like bundles. And when I was thinking about land back, it really appeared to me as a sort of metaphorical sacred bundle, a concept that contains important information that teaches and guides us towards solidarity with Indigenous people. So, to better understand the layers of meaning held within the concept of land back, I pulled out some of the key words and phrases spoken by those Indigenous youth in the video. So let's take a look at them. Land back is a philosophy. It's more than just about the physical ownership of the land. It's a bundle of meaning for Indigenous people. And some of that meaning revolves around restitution, that real sense of economic justice that's missing from our current model of truth and reconciliation. There's the idea of jurisdiction, authority, autonomy. Land back is time and space for our communities to heal. It's about reciprocity and giving back. So if you're a settler and you're looking at being involved in truth and reconciliation and you want to root your actions in solidarity and in land back, then you have to think in this way of reciprocity. How can you give back? What can you give to the process? It's about asking for consent. This whole idea too of nothing about us without us, right? So any work in truth and reconciliation needs to engage with and ask for the consent of Indigenous people. It's using your strengths to act. So what are your gifts? What do you bring to the table? What can you give back? How can you use your strengths to take action? How can you truly show up? Everyone has a role to play. Of course, it means land back in our hands as Indigenous people, and that is one aspect of it that's very important. It's about financial and in-kind contributions. What are other ways beyond just giving the physical land back that restitution can happen, that economic justice can happen? What are the ways that, say, for example, if you work with an organization, how can your organization find ways to financially support Indigenous initiatives or support those initiatives in kind? And of course, it's about being Indigenous led. So standing behind Indigenous people and supporting them in the efforts that they identify as important to them. So if we want to continue unpacking this idea of land back, I like to think of land back, and it's important to think of land back as the Indigenous response to truth and reconciliation. And by understanding land back, we can understand what Indigenous people need from the truth and reconciliation process. So let's take a minute to compare the current truth and reconciliation process as it stands with the concept of land back. So let's start by taking a little bit of a closer look at Settler Canada's response, which is really, I think, embodied in a lot of ways by our current truth and reconciliation process. But for a lot of Indigenous people, it often seems like the very process of truth and reconciliation is being colonized. The narrative of truth and reconciliation is largely being defined by the settler colonial state, who all too often seem to be taking the reins on defining what reconciliation looks like without actually consulting Indigenous people on that question or asking what reconciliation actually looks like for Indigenous people. So let's take a closer look at what Settler Canada's approach to truth and reconciliation has looked like. Now, I don't want to say that nothing positive has come from the truth and reconciliation efforts of Settler Canada. As Settler Murray Sinclair stated, education is what got us here, and education is what will get us out. And I think we've really come a long way on that front. And I think that really, the education component really represents the truth aspect of truth and reconciliation. And, you know, our collective future will be much brighter thanks to a lot of incredible efforts going on now by both Indigenous and non-Indigenous educators, school teachers who are educating young Canadians on Indigenous matters. And even the Canadian media is doing a far better job than it used to do in covering and Indigenous issues and making and creating space for Indigenous voices and Indigenous created content. And there are many more Canadians today who are aware of Canada's history of oppression of Indigenous peoples and the ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples. And every day, more and more of them are becoming allies to Indigenous people. So there are some good things happening for sure. But we're here today to take a more critical look at things. And here's what I and many other Indigenous people are seeing. So first of all, the current truth and reconciliation process seems largely performative in nature, resulting in very little tangible change. We have heard apologies, formal apologies on behalf of the Canadian government, formal apologies on behalf of the Catholic Church. We have land acknowledgements. These have become pervasive. But at the same time, they're like the apologies, really only words. People are sorry that, you know, they stole our land, but they really honor us. So their land acknowledgements can seem very hollow and largely performative. There's been, of course, commissions and inquiries and so many reports. And from these reports, so many recommendations. all of which together provide a clear guide for the changes required here in Canada to end Indigenous oppression. Let's consider some of these reports. In 2015, 10 years ago, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. And according to the Yellowhead Institute, and their most recent, the 2023 status update on the implementation status of the 94 calls to action, and I imagine a new report for 2024 will be coming out soon. But in the last decade, since the release of the 94 calls to action, only 13 of the calls to action have been implemented. 81 calls still remain unfulfilled. 0 calls to action were completed in 2023, and only 2 of the 42 legacy calls to action. So that's number 1 to 42 of the 94 calls to action are the legacy calls to action, and they are considered the most critically important that have been addressed. 2 of them in 10 years have been implemented. Then in 2019, we had the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And that report included 231 calls for justice. Now, while a federal action plan and some provincial action plans were created, in 2024, the former commissioners of the inquiry expressed real grave concerns that there had been very limited tangible progress on these calls for justice. And those are some of the most recent reports, but I want to take you back all the way to 1996. And what some people may or may not remember, a hugely significant inquiry was Canada's Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And in 1996, that commission released its report. And this commission specifically explored the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, and the relationship between Indigenous people and the Canadian government. Now, that report was 6 published volumes and included 440 recommendations. And guess what? In almost several decades, very few of those recommendations ever saw the light of day. So what does all this amount to? Settler Canada sure seems to be focusing their reconciliation efforts on words. And tangible, meaningful action is largely absent. There are a lot of allies seeking to build relationships with us now, which is definitely a good thing. But we really need you to move from words to action. And we really need your actions to be rooted in solidarity. Now, I want to consider this. Let's look at what the truth and reconciliation process looks like from an Indigenous perspective. Now, I often say that I've heard this from many other Indigenous people as well, is that we wish that the truth and reconciliation process had been called truth and restitution. Let's look more closely at this word restitution. You know, back as land back, as Riley Yesno in the video stated, is a demand not for symbolic gestures, but material restitution. It's like Settler Canada just wants to skip over restitution, which really amounts to the justice part of all of this. And what really is the very hardest work at the heart of this process. But they want to just jump over it and get to the good stuff, the feel-good stuff that is summarized by the idea of reconciliation. It's a little bit like putting the cart before the horse, because we cannot get to reconciliation without economic justice, without restitution. So, simply speaking, from the Indigenous perspective, reconciliation cannot happen without restitution. So truth and restitution, this is land back. So I'd like to take a closer look at this word, this very important word, restitution. And so what I did is I've taken the definition of the word restitution from the Oxford Languages Dictionary. And that definition has three parts to it. And the first part of the definition of the word restitution is the restoration of something to its original state. So you'll recall that I mentioned Justice Sinclair saying that it's not the responsibility of Indigenous people to reconcile with non-Indigenous people. Our responsibility as Indigenous people is to reconcile with ourselves, our own indigeneity, our own communities, to restore what has been lost. You heard some of the young folks in the video speak to this about knowing, returning to that knowing of what it means to be, in my case, Métis, or what it means to be Anishinaabe or Cree, and that ability to return to the heart of the culture. That's what our responsibility is as Indigenous people and what reconciliation ultimately means for us. It's not so much about our relationship with non-Indigenous people, but our relationship with ourselves and our own indigeneity and our own communities. So let's take a look about at what exactly is it that we're trying to restore. We are looking to restore the connection, our connection to and our relationship with the land. We're looking to restore our Indigenous worldviews, cultures, values, beliefs, and our languages. The restoration of our Indigenous knowledge systems that have, for the most part, entirely been excluded and discounted. The restoration of our Indigenous laws and political systems, which are critical to our sense of sovereignty as nations. Our personal and community healing and trauma. The restoration of our sovereignty. That's what all of these things together add up to. When Indigenous people say land back, this is a huge part of what we mean. Is this return to our connection to the land that was severed and the restoration of all that we are when we live in relationship to the land. There's a link in the resource guide that I've provided to just an excellent talk that Jesse Wente gave. Jesse Wente is an Anishinaabe, and he is the chair of the Canada Council of the Arts. And he gave this talk on CBC Ideas. It was a talk on Indigenous futures. And it's just an absolute essential listen. He does such a fantastic job. But there is one quote something that he says in that talk, and that is that the future that we want has already existed. We just need to restore it. So let's look at the next definition of restitution, which is the restoration of something lost or stolen to its proper owner. So what has been stolen from Indigenous people? Of course, our lands and resources. Our connection to the land has been stripped from us. Our languages have been taken from us. Our laws and lifeways. Our knowledge and stories. Our sacred items and cultural artifacts. Our ceremonies, which for a long time in this country were outlawed. We could go to jail for practicing our ceremonies. Our sovereignty and our connection to ourselves and our communities, our histories, our families, our children, all of these things have been taken from us. It was hard for me to create this slide because it just seems like there's been so much taken, so much loss. And, you know, of course, our children continue to be stolen. There are more Indigenous kids in the hands of the government today than there ever were in the whole era of the residential school system. We're still losing our children. You know, I really wish that folks could appreciate the magnitude of what has been lost and the incredibly long road it will take to restore. And that is to say, what can be restored. We as Indigenous people are incredibly grateful to our ancestors and the presence of mind that they had to protect and safeguard so many of these critical aspects of our cultures so that today those threads can be picked up and restored. You know, in many parts of the world, Indigenous cultures were wiped off the face of the planet without a trace, without any threads to restore the cultures. This is something that Jesse Wente mentions in that talk on Indigenous futures. He really speaks to that presence of mind of our ancestors who knew that the world was changing and they knew they needed to adapt to that new world. But at the same time, they knew the value of what they had about the Indigenous knowledge, the Indigenous stories, and life ways and systems and how critically important those were to humanity. And they took steps to safeguard those. And it is thanks to those steps that they took. It's thanks to those ancestors who left those threads behind that we're able to pick them up and weave them back together today. And that is ultimately the work that we as Indigenous folks are doing as part of reconciliation. This is what reconciliation ultimately means to us. Now, the third definition of restitution is recompense for injury or loss. And this really hones in on the justice aspect of truth and reconciliation and what's needed if you are looking at it from the perspective of restitution. And again, this doesn't necessarily mean, I've spoken about the greatest land theft in humankind has been the land theft and the resource theft from Indigenous people on Turtle Island. And so those reparations for that theft are required for reconciliation to take place. Economic justice is required for reconciliation to take place. And if it's not land back in our hands, which in some ways and in whatever ways that it can be, should be, then economic justice needs to take place in its place. Reparations and compensation for the harms and damages done that considers the enormity of what was lost. You know, in my community here, it's hard for healing to take place when young people can't stay in their community because there's no jobs for them, when people don't have adequate housing, when people don't have drinking water in their homes, when they don't have ways to adequately support their families. Healing just can't happen. We can't restore everything that we need to restore without the resources to do so. So it just ends up being this cycle that continues because that economic justice, that restitution is not taking place. Instead, we're hearing a lot of words, apologies, land acknowledgements, etc., reports, recommendations. But what's needed is the economic justice, the restitution and recompense for the damages that have been done. So when you're looking at what actions that you can take as far as truth and reconciliation goes, whether you are an individual or an organization, You need to really think about how your actions are embodying this kind of restitution, and this redistribution of the wealth and resources and opportunities, so as to level the playing field, to give us an opportunity to do the kind of restoration work that is our responsibility as Indigenous people to do. Now, let's move into talking about how to apply the land back lens. To summarize the main points, or key takeaways from what I've said so far, actions are needed now, not words. Land acknowledgements are not enough. We need you to take action. Those actions need to be rooted in solidarity, which means building relationships with Indigenous people in your local communities, finding out what's important to them, what they need from you, and then doing those things. So ensuring your actions are Indigenous-led. And then making sure that your actions are informed by land back. So understanding the concept of land back, spending some time diving into that concept, more so than the summary I've given you here, but diving into the resources that are in the resource guide, especially the Yellowhead Institute's online land back course. Spend some time taking yourself through that course, and then make sure that any actions that you take are centered in and informed by land back. Because land back embodies the truth and the restitution that's required by Indigenous people for reconciliation. Now, before we talk about some practical ways you can carry that out, I want to share just a few examples of land back and reconciliation in action. Now, these are just a few examples, by no means exhaustive, but just a few examples that come immediately to mind for me. And first, when we talk about actually giving the land back, a great example is last year in 2024, the government of British Columbia transferred the title of over 200 islands off Canada's west coast to the Haida people, recognizing their Aboriginal land title throughout Haida Gwaii. But land back may not always look like returning physical land. It can also mean that Indigenous people are able to exercise their rights to self-government on their lands and enforce laws and regulations in ways that they see fit. So the Chilcotin Nation is a great example of an Indigenous nation asserting rights and jurisdiction over their land. That nation is made up of 6 member communities located in British Columbia. And in 2014, the Chilcotin Nation's inherent rights to self-governance were affirmed by the Supreme Court. And then in 2018, the Chilcotin introduced regulations that required all non-Chilcotin people to acquire a permit in order to harvest morel mushrooms, which is a real big thing on their territory. So that allowed, these permits allowed morel mushroom hunters onto Indigenous land. And the Chilcotin now oversee and administer all the permitting for mushroom picking on their territory. This makes me think a bit too, this hasn't actually taken place yet, but here in Manitoba, and it hasn't really been talked about, but I know that these conversations are taking place, and that's that there's a discussion underway right now to look at the prospect of returning Whiteshell Provincial Park, which is a provincial park on the eastern edge of Manitoba on the Canadian Shield, a really beautiful, beautiful area, and real cottage country here in Manitoba. But that Whiteshell Provincial Park, it contains some of the most sacred Anishinaabe ceremonial sites, and including, one particular site that is probably one of the most sacred sites to Indigenous people in maybe all the world. So it's extremely important, and I very much look forward to the possibility that Whiteshell Provincial Park will be one day again in the hands and caretaking of the Anishinaabe. This makes me think of Riding Mountain National Park, which I showed you at the beginning of this talk on the map, the park in the shape of the gun. And Indigenous folks were cleared from that land in order for that park to be created and for everybody else in Canada to be able to enjoy it. And Indigenous folks have had a real hard time accessing their rights to that land. But as part of restitution for that, Indigenous people enjoy free admission to the park. So I, as a Métis person, can go to Riding Mountain National Park without having to purchase a park pass. Now, there's other examples like this. Like, for example, Via Rail offers a 30% discount to Indigenous people. In Winnipeg here, there's all sorts of museums, art galleries, theaters, and other cultural institutions that offer free admission to Indigenous people. That's all aspects of restitution. And another great example is the Catholic Church. They have a National Indigenous Reconciliation Fund. This is a national initiative. It was established to accept donations from 73 Catholic entities from across the country and to advance healing and reconciliation initiatives. So the fund supports projects that are determined locally and in collaboration and leadership by First Nations, Métis, and Inuit partners. So those are all just, examples of restitution and the different ways that it can look like. Another item that I, wanna highlight is, and for those of you who I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it did, was of course in the national news, was the call to search the landfills here in Manitoba. And that was because there were 3 Indigenous women who were murdered, and it was anticipated, it was known that their bodies were likely in a landfill north of the city of Winnipeg. But the decision was made to not search the landfill for their bodies. And of course, this resulted in a huge outcry from the Indigenous community, most notably from the families of these missing and murdered women. And at the time, those families and their supporters, they spent over 2 years, protesting and calling for the search of that landfill, which completely fell on deaf ears here in Manitoba. But they spent winters out at the protest camps at the major landfill that's south of Winnipeg, and at another major camp that was at the Forks, right at the heart of Winnipeg. And so much so did their calls fall on deaf ears that the whole issue became the incumbent Conservative government used it as a wedge issue. There were even billboards in Winnipeg, talking about this election issue, and the very fact that the call to search the landfills for Indigenous women was being made a political issue, and that the families had to fight for it, and they had to pay for feasibility studies to be done, and all of this. When in reality, we all know that if it were white women who were suspected to be in that landfill, that landfill would have been searched. And so it took a change of government. It took an Indigenous premier with the election of Wab Kinew, which in and of itself was a powerful moment for Indigenous people here in our province. I remember crying that night when Wab was elected, and that stage filled up with Anishinaabe people when he came to do his acceptance speech. And that was a powerful moment for myself and for all Indigenous people, or many Indigenous people in this province. But it took that change in leadership and for, a government led by an Indigenous leader to make that that landfill search happen. And I remember at the start of it, when it all came out that these women were likely in, in the landfill. I remember thinking that with all this talk of reconciliation that was going on, it was mind-boggling to me that it wasn't just immediately seen as an incredible opportunity to demonstrate, reconciliation, to put reconciliation in action. And we really failed miserably as a community by not responding to that call. And it's a really great example about how Settler Canada's version of reconciliation is largely based in words and lip service, and that anything that is won and accorded to Indigenous people is ultimately hard fought for by our people, such as the case of the ultimate search for the landfill, that search is currently underway. And just recently, both the remains of Morgan Harris and Mercedes Moran were recovered. And those women are going home to their communities finally and at long last. And while not recovered yet, there was a third woman who was unknown and unidentified, and she was given the name of Buffalo Woman. And recently it was announced that while she has not been recovered, her identity was established, and she is Ashley Shingoose from St. Teresa Point First Nation here in Manitoba. So, that's an example of where we have definitely faltered in our pursuit of reconciliation. But hopefully the fact that landfill search did take place and is taking place, and that those families will find some peace. Another great initiative that is, again, runs out of Manitoba here, but I believe it takes place across Canada, is an initiative called Circles of Reconciliation. And what Circles of Reconciliation does is they bring together groups of 10 people, 5 Indigenous people and 5 non-Indigenous people, with 2 trained facilitators. And they meet together for a course of 7 meetings where they talk and discuss, in this small group setting, get to really get to the heart of the matter, and getting to know and talk one-on-one with each other. And this, as I mentioned before, when I said that reconciliation will never be a top-down, will never be effective with a top-down approach, but it has to come from the grassroots on up. It's about interpersonal connections and relationships between individuals in the community. And that's what Circles of Reconciliation is doing. And the more kind of initiatives like this, where we can actually bring people together to get to know one another, to have really good conversations about what the the Indigenous experience is in Canada, that's where real change will happen. So I really encourage you to think about how you can create opportunities like that, because they are just essential to this process. Another great example of reconciliation in action is the University of Alberta. They put together an Indigenous Canada course, and they made it available. It's online and available free of charge to anybody who wants to take it. And I strongly encourage all of you to take some time to take that course. So that course was designed by Indigenous people, and just the very fact that it's completely accessible to everyone. all you have to do is take the time to sit down and go through that course. And I can tell you, having looked at it through it myself, that it's an excellent course and really well done. So I highly recommend. The link to it is in the resource guide, of course. So please have a look at that and take the time. Of course, vitally important to Indigenous people are all the language revitalization efforts. And one of the things that's been just key for that is the offering of free language classes in a variety of Indigenous languages to Indigenous people. And then the classes are open to everyone, not just Indigenous people. And I really strongly encourage you to learn some of the Indigenous languages spoken by the people in your area where you live. Um, it is one of the best ways to learn about Indigenous worldview, because all of our worldview, our teachings, our values and beliefs are carried within the language. So learning even just a little bit of the language will help you learn about who we are as Indigenous people and how we think and operate. But I've directly benefited from these kind of initiatives, allowing me to both learn Anishinaabe and very recently to start Michif language classes. This is really at the heart of things for us. This is when I talk about restitution and that definition of restoring what was lost or stolen and our return to, our ways, like our Indigenous ways before we were colonized. The return to language is at the very heart of everything, because the language for us carries all of our teachings and worldviews and beliefs. So it's vital to us, and it's why so much effort was put in to extinguish and exterminate the languages as part of the colonial effort. And one thing really exciting that happened last year is that Disney decided to put out an Anishinaabe version of the first Star Wars movie. And that was really exciting for all of us who are Anishinaabe speakers, because to see ourselves reflected in Now, finally, let's look at some practical actions and tips that you can keep in mind for doing this work in a good way. And what this work will look like for each of you will be entirely different and unique. There is no recipe or one size fits all solution for this. And there really is no guidebook, because we are literally inventing the guidebook as we go along. So what's most important is that you have a willingness to make mistakes, and to get it wrong. You can't let that fear hold you back. Remember the discomfort that we talked about before? That discomfort is an inherent part of this process. And it's the discomfort that comes from knowing that we're going to make mistakes, and at times we're going to fail to do this work in a good way. And those are all learning opportunities in how we can do this work better. So really embrace that discomfort, embrace that willingness to make mistakes, and don't let that stand in your way of taking action. Also, remember, and this is more for those of you who are working in the newcomer settlement sector as far as what your role is. And what I like to say is that I would say that your role is primarily to interrupt prejudice and create curiosity. And what I mean by that is, the prejudice towards Indigenous people, the stereotypes and all of this, it develops really quickly. Newcomers to Canada absorb that in shockingly fast. And so your job is to really interrupt that from happening. And one great example of this is comes from the Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society in Edmonton. They partnered with settlement service agencies in Edmonton to provide traditional welcomes by Indigenous people at the airport when newcomers arrive. I've seen some videos of this. It's really powerful to have that kind of welcome offered to people and that initial really positive experience that happens the minute folks set foot in their new home city. And I remember a story that one of my colleagues who is involved in this told about a little boy who'd come with his family to Canada, and they received this welcome from Indigenous folks who came in their regalia and did that traditional welcome right at the airport. And this is a very powerful experience for this little boy. And a few days later, when that newcomer family was in the park, the little boy saw one of the Indigenous individuals who was a part of that welcome, and he ran up to him and was like, "Hey, I remember you. You were there when we arrived. You were there and welcomed us." And so it really goes to show like how powerfully that imprints on people, and it stands, it creates just a great positive first experience. And those kind of whatever those kind of positive first experiences, whatever form they take, they really have a powerful impact in terms of interrupting that prejudice that can develop really quickly. So it's not your job, to necessarily to teach about all of this, what has happened in Canada's past and present and the present oppression of Indigenous folks. That is the job of Indigenous people to do. But it is your job to learn about the truth so that you can walk right in all of this, and to look at how you can create opportunities for newcomers to connect with and learn from the local Indigenous people in their community directly. So that's the real role and task that you have. And in doing this work, you have to remember that relationship building is key. Relationship building takes a very long time. So not a lot of this work can happen really quickly, and we really have to have patience to develop those good relationships if we want to do this work in a good way. So when you fully understand the truth of what has happened and continues to happen to Indigenous folks in this country, you will understand why there is an enormous amount of distrust from Indigenous folks towards approaches from non-Indigenous people. And this can be a huge barrier to doing this work, but you can't let it deter you. You have to understand that it's a normal reaction for folks to have who have gone through this trauma and who are still going through it. So this is why that relationship building is so important, and why it can take a lot of time. So be prepared for that. Be prepared to take a lot of baby steps, and that sometimes the work, we're very accustomed in this sort of colonial way of operating, of doing things quickly and on our own agendas. And we think we have a great idea and we want to implement it, or we have funding for something right now, but it needs to happen within the next month or something like that. And those are all ways of approaching this that can really cause damage to our relationships. And so we need to be more thoughtful and a little bit more measured and patient in our approaches, and understanding that that relationship building is key and it is going to take a lot of time. The other thing when we're looking at this relationship building is being willing and to be aware of the importance of going into that relationship building with cultural humility. So this is why the decolonization process is so important. It's really, and when I talk about the decolonization process, I'm not just talking about how we can decolonize our systems and processes, sort of on a grander scale, but I'm talking about how we decolonize ourselves as individuals to the point where we're able to understand when we are thinking and acting from a colonial perspective or way of doing things. And being able to take that perspective off and set it aside, and be open to different ways of thinking and doing and operating. This is also a really a big aspect in terms of how we approach things like organizing workshops or sessions. We tend to be very, agenda bound, time bound. A lot of the processes and procedures that we're accustomed to using in our workspaces and how we do our work can really create uninviting spaces for Indigenous folks to operate in. And, it can be hard for us to set those aside because we're so accustomed to operating in that manner, but it's really critical that we be able to pause and think about different approaches, to talk to Indigenous folks about what approaches would be most comfortable for them, as opposed to us imposing our ways of doing things and expecting Indigenous folks to fit into that. Try to do it the other way around, and see what comes of that. Because I think overall, then it creates a much more safe and positive environment for Indigenous folks to be, interested in engaging in that and feel comfortable engaging in it. Of course, it's really important also to learn about the Indigenous people in your area and find out what issues and initiatives are important to them. So, and again, ask how you can best support those initiatives. And I always say, try and find the grassroots people, the grassroots activists, those who are closest to the community, not necessarily going to the top of the chain, the leadership, the chiefs and councils. This work is really embedded in the grassroots and the relationships between people. So try and find those activists, those community members who are really involved at the grassroots, whether they be land defenders, water protectors, and see how you can best support their initiatives. I can tell you from the call to search the landfill in Manitoba here, how absolutely valued the engagement by non-Indigenous people and the support of non-Indigenous people were in that call. As Indigenous folks, we could all together, all at once, stand up and scream, and the powers that be would still be deaf to our calls. They still would not listen. They've developed just an enormous ability to tune us out. So what becomes really powerful in the role that you can play as allies working in solidarity with us is to not only find out what initiatives are most important and critical to us, but to speak out on them and to speak out on them to the leaders in your community and your elected representatives. Because when the powers that be hear from non-Indigenous people, then they are more likely, sadly, to take action and do something. So, and I remember from being a part of the sort of the chat group for the call, the folks who were involved in calling for the landfill search. Every time a non-Indigenous group got in touch, offered their support, came to talk, came to the protest camps to talk to people and learn, or made donations or wrote letters of support, and posted those publicly, the chat would blow up with people being so blown away by that support, and it was really essential and very important. So please don't underestimate your role, because the government and the powers that be in general are counting on your apathy. They assume that you will be apathetic towards this and that they can carry on not doing anything. And let them underestimate you. And because the more that you call out and the more that you stand up behind Indigenous people, the more likely that those in charge will take action. Take that time to write letters, to speak to your elected representatives, and look at all the different ways that you can support these kind of grassroots initiatives. And that support can take on a variety of forms. In some ways it can be financial support. That's always very important, but it can also be in kind or material support to various initiatives, lending your time, even just coming and showing up and learning and taking an interest and showing that you care. But most importantly, taking that added step to voice your support out loud, whether that's in writing, whether that's in speaking, whether that's in sharing and trying to educate others. But that is just so critical to helping to push some of these Indigenous-led initiatives forward. Think about reaching out to Indigenous organizations in your community. And a great point of contact are the friendship centers. And for those of you who aren't aware of friendship centers, they are a network of Indigenous-led organizations, and there's a friendship center in pretty much every major urban center across Canada. And what friendship centers do is they effectively provide settlement services and supports to Indigenous folks who are moving to urban centers from their home communities. So their work is very much aligned with those of you who work in providing settlement services and supports to newcomers. So there's a lot of common ground there. And I always suggest looking at the Association of Friendship Centers. I've put a link in the resource guide to their website, but you'll find a list there of all the friendship centers across Canada, and they're a really great first point of contact for building relationships and looking at how you can collaborate together to serve both of the populations that you're working with. And, when you're going and approaching, whether it's Indigenous organizations or Indigenous communities in your local area, don't go with an ask. Don't go with a preconceived idea of what you want to do. Maybe you have a great project in mind. Maybe you have funding for something and you want to get some kind of initiative underway. Don't go with an ask as part of your first point of outreach. Instead, go with that cultural humility, that sense of curiosity, and ask what you can do to be of help and support, rather than asking Indigenous folks to help and support and be involved in your efforts. And along that same line, don't always invite Indigenous folks into your space, into colonized spaces. Think about how you can go to them in their communities, and ideally on the land. Come to our community events, our powwows, round dances, our jigging competitions, our cultural celebrations, and other Indigenous-led events. And not just on the major days, like National Indigenous Peoples Day or Orange Shirt Day and Truth and Reconciliation Day in September. Take these initiatives to go and visit us in our everyday, and really seek that out and just show up. You'll be well received and greatly appreciated. Now, along those lines, too, of connecting with Indigenous communities and organizations, look at how you can collaborate with Indigenous organizations and other immigrant-serving organizations and grassroots groups to create programs, events, supports that are mutually beneficial. You know, this doesn't just have to be you working alone, like whether you're in an individual or an organization, look at ways you can collaborate with others, because the more you work together, the stronger you can be. You can pool resources, you can make more initiatives happen. I like to think of the local immigration partnership here in Winnipeg. When I, follow their Facebook page, they make posts with information, resources, and events that are like speak to both immigrants and newcomers in the community, but also to Indigenous people. So they treat both groups as groups that they serve, and I think that is a really great way of looking at things. So really looking at another great thing is thinking back to what we were talking about earlier about the ways that Indigenous people have been completely excluded from immigration matters. Look at how you can leverage your expertise, the knowledge that you have, and how can you empower Indigenous people to have more involvement in immigration matters and in informing immigration policy. What are some pathways that you can create with that? And some of the most, one of the most important pathways is simply to share information and to help educate so that folks have an idea of how these decisions are made and can figure out how they can interact and engage with the process in a meaningful way. So how can you do that kind of, create those kind of opportunities? Collaborating with other settlement organizations in your community on engaging local Indigenous speakers, teachers, whether it's speaking to a topic or teaching about a cultural practice. These are always great initiatives. And, I do have to say, make sure, and it's kind of startling and somewhat disturbing that I even have to say this, but the experience tells me that I do, that make sure you're compensating Indigenous folks adequately for any services that they provide, whether it's coming to speak to your group or to teach a course or a workshop. It is really shocking how often Indigenous folks are not offered any compensation. And I hear this all the time. So, thinking back to that justice part, while there are experts, say from academia and stuff who will, willingly come and speak to a topic or do a presentation on something without compensation, that it's really thinking about this justice part of reconciliation and the fact that Indigenous people are not obligated to teach you. It's not their job to do this work, and doing this work takes an incredible emotional toll. Never mind the position that it can put us at risk of being the target of people's defensiveness, and even that lateral violence that I spoke about from within our own communities. So this is really important, and I only mention it because of the shocking number of times that I've heard from Indigenous folks that they've been asked to do something, and not being offered any compensation in any way. So really, beyond that, really focus on ways you can bring people together at a very grassroots level, thinking of that circles of reconciliation that I mentioned previously. How can you come up with and create opportunities like that, because those are the opportunities to whether it's an event like bringing a speaker in or doing a workshop, those create curiosity, and that curiosity is really important for setting newcomers on a pathway to building better relationships with the Indigenous folks in their own communities. So thinking of how you can create conversations as well that are more deep and meaningful, like those that are conducted by Circles of Reconciliation. Even get in touch with Circles of Reconciliation. Ask them to help facilitate and pull together some conversation circles like that for for your community and for your network and the people that you serve. And another, finally, a really significant thing that you can do is to look at how you can incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the actual settlement services and supports that you provide. Like what I mentioned before with the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture, incorporating Indigenous-led land-based learning as part of the services they provide for victims of torture, or EAL curriculum being developed that teaches about Indigenous culture at the same time. How can you look at identifying newcomers in your community who are Indigenous from the lands they left behind? How can you identify what kind of settlement supports that those folks might need? How can you speak with the Indigenous folks in your community to connect them? To connect those two groups of people together. These are all just, different things. It's not just about learning about outside issues, but really how can we bring in these other, the Indigenous teachings, knowledge, ways of doing things into and incorporate them into our daily work practices and the services and supports that we provide. Well, the last bit of advice that I'd like to leave you with, if you are an organization working in the newcomer settlement sector, is to consider joining the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation, or the NNCTR. The NNCTR exists to empower you, to provide you with resources, education, and supports that you need to undertake the work of truth and reconciliation in your local communities. The NNCTR is a national collective that aims to create a community of practice and a knowledge exchange hub where members from the newcomer settlement sector can collaborate in an environment of mutual support to advance truth and reconciliation and support better relationships between Indigenous and newcomer communities. The collective aims to do this by sharing resources and opportunities for learning, and by creating spaces for reflection and discussion. The NNCTR also exists to promote meaningful action towards reconciliation by encouraging acts of solidarity with Indigenous peoples by the newcomer settlement sector. So the idea is that together we can work towards decolonizing and reinventing the newcomer settlement sector with Indigenous inclusion, perspectives, and knowledge. Now, while the collective is national in scope, its structure is designed to be rooted in the local grassroots community level and to connect organizations within communities and within regions so they can come together and work collaboratively. The collective was spearheaded by the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture, who is also housing the project. I've been involved as one of the collaborators working to bring the collective to life through my work with the Canadian Refugee Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association, or the SAW Association. So the SAW Association has been a huge supporter of this project as a way to provide these supports to our members, who are all organizations from across the country who are involved in private refugee sponsorship. So we've been working together as collaborators for about 2.5 years to launch the collective and bring it into being. And during this time, we've been working to spread the word about it and also to form a national advisory committee with representation from all regions of Canada. And these advisory committee members act as the connection between the national collective and the local level. So we've also created an initial website that you'll find at nnctr.ca. And you'll find there an ever-growing collection of resources, many of which are specific to the newcomer settlement sector. And I'm really excited to announce that the collective has recently received 3 years of funding from IRCC that will allow us to launch a whole number of activities, including a more robust resource and education library on our website, And we're also planning to have workshops and speaker series, a lot like this one, to provide opportunities for learning. And other exciting activities are coming down the pipeline soon. So now is a really good time to visit our website and consider joining the collective as we gear up to do some good work. So you will find a link to the website in the resource guide, along with a link to download a PDF flyer. So if you want to download that, and feel free to circulate it within your organization or amongst your networks, and encourage others in the sector to join. So as I wrap up here, I want to circle back to what I said earlier about immigration long being used as a tool of colonialism, and how we in the newcomer settlement sector are well placed and have the power and even the obligation to subvert that. And through our efforts to transform immigration into a tool of community building by fostering good relationships and relationships of solidarity between Indigenous and newcomer communities. I hope this session has acted as a guide in supporting you in doing that work. Marseille, miigwech, and thank you all for taking the time to listen.